Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today. Distinguished guests and participants from various institutions and countries, thank you for being with us for this timely and important discussion entitled Decolonising the Global Order, Is Justice Possible? My name is Kalisha, and I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar explores whether genuine global justice can be achieved within the current international system. Throughout this session, we will discuss the difference between political independence and continued structural dependence, the lasting influence of colonial power relation in global institutions, the role of knowledge and narrative in shaping global perspective, the challenges faced by countries in the global south, and the possibilities as well as limitation of decolonizing international systems. Before we begin, allow me to briefly outline the flow of today's webinar. Today's speaker will first deliver his presentation for approximately 30 minutes. This will then be followed by a question and answer sessions. Participants are welcome to submit their questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A functions, and we will address as many questions as time permits. So if you have questions during the presentation, you can submit it immediately to the Q&A box. We are honored to have with us a distinguished scholar whose work has contributed significantly to the study of history, politics, colonialism, and identity in the contemporary world. Our speaker today is Professor Farish A, a Malaysian academic, historian, and political scientist. His main area of research and writing is colonial Southeast Asia in the 19th century, with a particular focus on the workings of the discourse of racialized colonial capitalism. His work examines how colonial systems of knowledge shape understandings of the region and how these legacies continue to influence contemporary politics, identity, and global power relations. Professor Farish has authored numerous books and scholarly publications that examine the historical foundation of today's political realities and the continuing impact of colonialism on societies and institutions around the world. We are truly privileged to have him with us today to share his insight on these important topics. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Farish A. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kalisa. I think that there are a lot of things that we can discuss today, and I don't think we can do justice to it within a space of an hour. But allow me to perhaps begin by making a few observations that I think are relevant to our discussion here. As you know, I'm talking to you now from Indonesia, where I'm currently based. And if you've been following the regional news, then you will know that Indonesia is currently experiencing a somewhat devastating economic crisis with the collapse of the Indonesian stock exchange. And equally spectacular has been the collapse of the Indonesian rupiah, which has been plummeting nonstop over the last year, certainly since the end of last year until now. And it has now reached record levels. Now, when we have a situation like this, and you have a country like Indonesia experiencing collapse, we need to ask some obvious questions, such as, does this actually have anything to do with the actual economic fundamentals of Indonesia, or is there something else going on? Now, if you were to follow the news in the region and even beyond the region, you may have seen or read commentaries that talk about how this current economic crisis in Indonesia seems somewhat similar to the crisis of 1998. Now, I believe that is a wrong comparison, because the economic fundamentals of Indonesia in 1998 were very, very different from the condition that we have now. If you go back to 97 and 98, the East Asian financial crisis at that time was partly the result of inefficient economic planning, which led to things like a proliferation of banks, indiscriminate credit expansion, stock markets that were really getting out of control. The Kuala Lumpur stock market was the third most active in the world at the time, and investors began to worry as to whether the development that we had seen in Southeast Asia was beginning to turn into a bubble. And of course, with the floating of the Thai baht in 1997, 1998, all the other currencies of the region, the Thai baht, the Filipino peso, the Malaysian ringgit, the Singapore dollar, and the Indonesian rupiah all collapsed. Now, fast forward by more than 2.5 decades, and we have a situation in Indonesia where this time it is only Indonesia. It is only Indonesia that is going through a major financial crisis at the moment. The stock market has been declining in value in terms of trade over the last few months. The Indonesian rupiah has been on a downward spiral for the last few months. And so we need to ask, is this because of any structural weaknesses in the Indonesian economy? And actually, when we look at the fundamentals, Indonesia's economic fundamentals are actually quite sound, certainly much, much better off than they were 2.5 decades ago in 1998. You already have significant, controls of banks. The banking sector has been better regulated. Banks have been recapitalized. You do not have the kind of indiscriminate credit expansion that we saw in the early 90s and the mid 90s, where anyone could get a loan for anything. That's not happening. And Indonesia remains, a major producer of things like nickel. It's the biggest producer of nickel in the world. It's also, it holds one of the biggest reserves of rare earths, which, as we all know, is crucial to things like electric cars and handphones. And therefore, these are assets of enormous strategic and economic importance. But the reason why the rupiah has been doing so badly and the stock market has been doing so badly is because of sentiment. And these sentiments tend to revolve around certain preconceived understandings about Indonesia and Indonesians and Indonesian political and economic praxis. And these are stereotypes really that go back to the 80s and 90s. The idea that, Indonesians and other Southeast Asians, by extension, do not know how to run their economies, that there is massive corruption. Of course, I'm not denying that there has been cases of corruption. Even now, more and more cases are coming up in Indonesia all the time. But as I said earlier, the economic fundamentals of Indonesia are actually very sound. So we need to ask why this is happening. And let me, suggest another way of understanding what's happening in Indonesia today. Now, you have a president, Prabowo Subianto, and whether you agree or disagree with him, whether you like him or dislike him, I think is secondary. What we need to understand is that Prabowo's economic and political agenda is strongly nationalist. He's an economic nationalist, in the same way that Mahathir was an economic nationalist in Malaysia in the 80s. And Prabowo has obviously, made some mistakes, not least of which are the populist policies that he's introduced, including, free food, free meals at schools across the country. But he's also someone who's very keen to protect Indonesia's important economic strategic assets, including the nickel, the coal, the oil, the gas, and the rare earths that I mentioned earlier. And attempts by this administration to protect the Indonesian market and to protect its natural resources have been, I think, one of the catalysts that has led to this reaction on the part of the market, foreign investors, who are in a sense punishing Indonesia for attempting to control and retain, sovereignty over its national assets. And I think the reason why I wanted to start with this is because we are talking about colonialism and neo-colonialism and in the context of the post-colonial present. And I think if you were to look at it from this point of view, then you can see that what's happening in Indonesia at the moment really reveals the workings of an international economic order and an economic system which puts developing countries like Indonesia at an enormous disadvantage, and where the rules and the norms of international economics and international politics have already been set long before countries like Indonesia became independent. And the dilemma faced by many post-colonial states today is that they have to abide by the rules of the international system, even though they were not part of that international system when it was, it was developed in the past. So I think this is why, if we want to talk about uh, the question of lingering traces of colonialism in terms of structure and praxis, looking at Indonesia today is actually quite important. So let me, then, talk about another thing which is related to this. Why is this important? This is important, I think, because there is a perception among many post-colonial citizens of Asia and Africa and Latin America that we now live in a post-colonial world. And the term post-colonial is somewhat misleading. As a historian, I find this problematic because we tend to think of history in episodic terms. So, history is not seen as a continuity, but rather as episodes, like in a TV series, episode 1, episode 2, episode 3. And many historians still, are inclined to use terms like pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. I've never accepted this in my own work because I've always argued that there are continuities from the pre-colonial to the colonial, and there are certainly continuities from the colonial to the post-colonial. And I think what we are seeing now in Indonesia, and this doesn't just affect Indonesia, it affects basically all post-colonial economies today. And all of this would indicate that the lingering, influence of modes of colonial praxis, economic and political praxis, are still very much with us until now. And so, how is this the case? Why has this happened? And I think this requires us to talk a bit about how we understand colonialism. Now, Kalisha earlier mentioned that my work has been on 19th century colonial Southeast Asia, and that's true. For the last 15 years, all of my books have been about colonial Southeast Asia. But what I try to do in my work is I try to show how, if we're going to understand colonialism and how colonialism succeeded and why it succeeded, I think we need to begin with one very important observation, and it is this. There is a tendency in many post-colonial states and societies to continue to regard and understand and see colonialism purely in terms of physical violence. That is the violence of battles and wars and conquest and appropriation and what have you. Now, of course, I'm not denying that there was a lot of violence involved, particularly in the colonization of some parts of Africa and Asia. Burma, for instance, experienced 3 wars with the British: the First, Second, and Third Anglo-Burmese Wars of 1924-26, 1952-53, 1852-1853, and 1885. So, India, for instance, was conquered, through a very violent process, leading to successive wars, the Maratha Wars, for example, those Sikh wars, wars in Punjab. So I'm not denying that there was violence, but the important thing for us to understand is that this violence, once it had succeeded in securing the goals of conquest, of territorial conquest, this violence was very, very quickly superseded by something far more subtle and far more effective and permanent, which is a kind of ideological epistemic violence, where modern colonialism was basically seen as a form of management in the way that we understand management today. And so a lot of the concepts that we understand now, a lot of the terms that we use, like development, for example, modernization, industrialization, these are all terms that really became prominent from the 19th century onwards, because we must understand that modern colonialism was basically driven by capital. It was driven by markets. It was driven by commercial interests. And it would be, counterproductive for these colonial wars to go on indefinitely, because the aim of modern colonization was economic control and economic conquest. Yeah. So obviously, you don't keep fighting wars all the time, because you never get to develop the economy and you never get to make money. And I think that mindset has become pervasive in many parts of the colonized world, because what modern colonialism did was it brought with it a certain way of looking at how states should be built, how nature should be harnessed, how nature can be exploited, how communities should be governed and run and managed. And so the regimes of knowledge and power that accompanied modern colonialism were really the things that we need to understand. If you want to understand colonialism, right, and the impact of colonialism and how deep colonialism was, um, you, I think you would do well not to focus too much on the wars that were fought, but crucially, you should focus on how, after these wars were fought and won, how all of these colonial regimes, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, began to govern and regulate their societies, their colonies, and introduce, new modes of governance, new modes of social management and regulation through institutions, through laws, through new forms of political and economic praxis that eventually became part and parcel of modern colonialism. So modern colonialism cannot be separated from market economics. And I think this is why I get somewhat disappointed when a lot of people talk about colonialism without talking about capitalism. You cannot talk about modern colonialism without talking about free market economics, because more often than not, it was free market economics that served as the justification and the rationale for the kinds of, colonial regimes that they built afterwards. Now, from there, we have to look at the lasting impact of colonialism. And I think here, this is one of the reasons why in our part of the world, that is, in Asia and Africa, discussions about colonialism become difficult. They become difficult because there is a tendency among some people to want to oversimplify colonialism in terms that are dialectical, i.e., that you have, violent, oppressive Western regimes that simply want to colonize and dominate and subjugate Asian and African societies. Now, on the surface of it, that is true, but we are missing out on a very, very important question. And the question is actually staring at us in the face. And the question is this: how did a few thousand Englishmen control the whole of India or the whole of Burma? How did a few thousand Frenchmen control the whole of Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia? How did a few thousand Dutchmen control the whole of Indonesia? Yep. I mean, even at the height of the Western colonial powers, these Europeans were not superhuman. They were not 50 feet tall. They did not have superpowers. They were every bit as human as you and I. and and so we need to explain how this happened. I mean, how did colonialism succeed, and why did it last for so long? Why did it last for, in some countries like Philippines, half a millennium, 500 years? In the case of Indonesia, 200 years. In the case of India, 200 years. How did this happen? How did colonialism survive and succeed for so long? And the brutal answer, the honest answer, is that colonialism only succeeded because of Asian and African collaboration. We cannot escape this, yeah? Because British imperialism in India succeeded because a lot of Indians became, part of the British Empire. If you look at the British colonial army in India, they were mostly Indian troops. If you look at the Dutch colonial army in Indonesia, a lot of the troops were Indonesian troops. They were soldiers from Madura, from Ambon, from Ternate, who were brought into the colonial apparatus. So this means that we cannot talk about colonialism without talking about native collaboration. And this collaboration, this willingness on the part of Asians and Africans to themselves become part of the colonial enterprise is one of the reasons why modern colonialism actually survived for so long and succeeded in doing what it did. Now, part of that success can be seen until today, where if you look at many post-colonial societies in Asia and Africa, even though officially, colonialism is over. You don't see any British flags or French flags or Spanish flags or Dutch flags anymore. But in terms of praxis, in terms of political praxis, in terms of how we rule our societies, govern our societies, manage our societies, manage our economies, we have totally internalized the logic of modern colonial capitalism. And so many post-colonial states in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, where I am now, were really built on the foundations of modern colonies. And the post-colonial state, therefore, can be seen as an extension of the colony. It is basically colonialism part 2, where now local elites, Asian elites, African elites, South American elites, play the same role, and get exactly the same benefits and favors as their former Western European counterparts, as they now take over the state and they govern the states in exactly the same way that colonial states were governed in the past. And I think this, for me, has always been the biggest problem faced by us in the post-colonial South, that we are still unable and unwilling to address the fact that colonialism actually succeeded, and it succeeded because of the fact that many colonized subjects willfully became part of the colonial enterprise. And they did so by agreeing with and subscribing to the logic of modern colonial rule. And that includes the way in which they view their societies, the way they understand their nations, the way they understand borders and territoriality, and the way they manage their economies. And so, all of this leads us to the crisis that we see in Indonesia today. As I mentioned earlier, this government, the current government in Indonesia, has been in many ways, trying to preserve and protect the economic sovereignty of Indonesia and to protect its, natural commodities and assets in particular. But almost all of the political elites and the business elites and the intellectual elites of Asia and Africa today are in so many ways, westernized in the way that they understand and see the world. Not westernized in the sense that they speak English or French, or not westernized in the sense that they prefer to wear Western clothes or Asian rather than Asian clothes. I mean, that's, for me, that's not westernization. Westernization in the sense that they completely agree with the fundamental principles and the ideological logic of modern free market, liberal capitalist economies. And so countries like Indonesia, but also, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, all the countries of Africa, all the countries of South Asia, we face the same dilemma. We talk about decolonization, but decolonization has to begin with understanding the extent to which we have already accepted the vocabulary and the epistemology and the geography of colonialism from the past. I mean, look at the map of Southeast Asia today. It's a colonial map. Yeah, the map of Southeast Asia was not drawn by Southeast Asians. It was drawn by the competing rival European powers between Holland and France and England and Spain and Portugal, and we've not even attempted to question, our understanding of political geography, our understanding of political territoriality, and so many of the issues that we face are not unique to us. If you were to read Basil Davidson's book, The Black Man's Burden, Africa and the Curse of the Nation State, in many ways, Basil Davidson talks about exactly the same thing, but in an African context, where he shows that the problems faced by many African political elites and African societies today are really problems that have been inherited from the colonial past, and inherited in a way that is completely unreflective, uncritical. So, like I said, I don't think that in a space of half an hour we can solve any of these issues or address any of these issues. But I think it is important for us to have discussions like this so that we begin to understand that the issues and the problems and the dilemmas that we face in the present are not entirely new. The way in which Indonesia now is being treated by the international business community, so to me at least, is very, very similar to the manner in which foreign Western capital treated and regarded the societies of Asia and Africa in the 19th century. And what is happening to Indonesia now as a result of Indonesia's attempts to remain, non-partisan, to remain neutral, to remain, allied and friendly to many parts of the world, America and China at the same time. All of this has contributed to the way Indonesia and Indonesia's economy is being punished at the moment. And I think this is a case where you really see the weaponization of capital and how, the free market system places countries in the developing South at an enormous disadvantage, because we have to abide by the rules of the game, and the rules of the game were not set by us. Yeah, they've never been set by us. And so we are still caught in this dilemma. On the one hand, many countries across the South, from Turkey to Japan, we want to develop, but our understanding of development has already been set and determined from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries by a certain, market-driven and market-guided, market-informed ideology of what constitutes proper economic development. And so the tragedy that we see now is that, for much of Southeast Asia, the environmental cost of all of this is catastrophic. We see the complete destruction of our natural ecosystem. We see the complete destruction of our rainforests. And why? Because all the countries of Southeast Asia want to get out of the lower income trap and want to become developed countries. But for us to become developed countries, we have to play by the game of international free market capitalism. And I think this is a road to ruin for all of us, because it cannot possibly, bring about any kind of genuine political or mental liberation. But in the end, it basically means that many countries in the South will continue trying to catch up with the West, with the developed North, on terms that have been set by the developed North. And if we look at the crisis that we see in Western Europe and North America at the moment, we can see that that model doesn't work there either. What's happening in America since Trump came to power a second time has really laid bare all the contradictions and the weaknesses of this kind of free market liberal capitalist economics. And we see the same happening in Europe now as well, where this kind of market liberalization has led to the withdrawal of the state and the retreat of the state, which has basically meant that millions of Europeans now do not have the kind of basic welfare protection that their parents enjoyed just one generation ago. So this is not a problem unique to Southeast Asia or Asia or Africa. It's a global problem. And I think for us to therefore talk about colonialism and whether we can address the legacy of colonialism, we have to, do the things I mentioned earlier. First, we have to understand that colonialism is not just about violence. Two, we must understand that colonialism requires the active participation of people who were colonized themselves. And three, we must understand that capitalism, was the thing that drove colonialism. Yeah, colonialism is not the result of racism. It's not the result of bigotry. I mean, racism and bigotry may have been symptomatic of colonialism, but they are not the causes of it. What drove colonialism was liberal free market capitalist economics. And I think that has remained dominant until now. So we need to have a discussion really not about, racism or prejudice or what have you, but rather about how a particular ideology has managed to become so hegemonic, and how by being hegemonic, it has now penetrated almost every level of, the world, of societies all over the world, both in the North and in the South, in the West and in the East. So perhaps, Kalisha, I'll stop there. And if you want to start having, I know, some questions or comments, we can, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Prof. That was a very great presentations. I've been listening a lot, especially because I am from Indonesia, and the current situation of Indonesia is really have been concerning for me too. And maybe while we wait for everyone's questions to be in the Q&A box, maybe I would like to ask a questions more like something that I've been thinking also, because I am from Indonesia again. Um, Knowing that everything that has been happening in Indonesia, it's been very concerning, but I actually wonder a lot, and I think you mentioned this also in the very beginning. Um, is it true that the current situation of Indonesia, with all the things going on with the rupiah going really low and many other things that we all know, is it true that everything has been escalating because of the colonialism that we faced that affected everything in the region? I mean, like you do mention about it, but I want to know more your point of view on this, especially with how you also mentioned about the capitalist, the liberal free market also. Please do answer these questions.
Well, okay, no, let me be a bit more specific here. Yeah. Um, I think what we see, I mean, the way in which Indonesia has been treated. Remember that this goes all the way back to 1945, yeah, with Indonesia's War of Independence against the Dutch, 1945 to 1949. And after Indonesia gained its independence, it was viewed by many Western powers, including the United States, yeah, as the most important country in Southeast Asia. If you go back, you can read all of these archive notes are all now online. You can go back and actually look at the minutes of the meetings from the time of Eisenhower all the way to Nixon, and how Indonesia was seen as a prize. Now, here's the dilemma. Yeah, countries like Indonesia, any post-colonial state, yeah, in the world, does not have the kind of independence it wishes it had. Indonesia, for instance, wanted to carve its own destiny and have its own identity, but you can't do that. You cannot do that because when Indonesia became independent, like Burma, like Malaysia, like India, like Pakistan, you immediately enter an international system where certain norms and rules have already been set, norms and rules of conduct, norms and rules of diplomacy, and norms and rules of economic engagement, trade, and what have you. Now, this is not new, yeah? I mean, Indonesia has had several nationalist leaders, perhaps the most famous being Sukarno. And when Sukarno nationalized many of the foreign capital assets in Indonesia, in the same way that Gamal Nasir tried to do that in Egypt, and Mossadegh tried to do in Iran, we all know what happened, right? I mean, in the case of Egypt under Nasir, Iran under Mossadegh, and Indonesia under Sukarno, there was an immediate backlash from the international business community to make sure that their invested capital interests were not threatened. And so this is what I mean by the legacy of neocolonialism, because you have to ask how and why was all this Western capital in Egypt, Indonesia, Iran in the first place. And that's the legacy of empire. That's because of decades and centuries of foreign capital penetration into these countries. So if you go back to Sukarno's time, what happened was very similar to what's happening now. Yeah, the Indonesian economy completely crashed. There was hyperinflation, political unrest. It eventually led to a lot of tension in Indonesian society, and ultimately Sukarno declaring a state of guided democracy, which basically ended democracy in Indonesia, and it became a dictatorship. Now, shortly after that, as we know, Sukarno was deposed and eventually he dies. And from 1965 until 1998, Indonesia's development has been shaped by the kind of westernized elites who were mainly educated in America and who mainly followed Western or American advice on how to develop the Indonesian economy. Now, despite following all this advice, despite doing what they were told, Indonesia still collapsed again in 1998. And so you see, right, that this is the trap. So what I'm saying is the legacy of colonialism, yeah, Kalisha, like I said, is not in statues or flags or things like that. It's in terms of how we run our countries, how we run our economies. And I do not believe that any country in the post-colonial world today has actually managed to successfully address the wider inequalities that we have in the global economic system. Burma in 1963 tried to do that by completely withdrawing from the world community, and Burma became an isolationist country under Ne Win, and for almost more than 2 decades, Burma pulled out of the Commonwealth, pulled out of the UN and all that, but it still did not, protect Burma. I mean, when Burma was eventually rehabilitated and became part of the international community again, it was even weaker than it was before because it had not, benefited from extensive economic trade and engagement with the rest of the world. And what's happening in Burma now is that you really see the powers of foreign capital, including Asian capital, really exploiting Burma to the maximum and keeping the military junta in power over there. So that's what I mean. It's again, you have to stop thinking of colonialism in terms of white people controlling brown people. Yeah. Colonialism was, yes, about that in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, but neocolonialism comes in the form of ideas. It's how ideas and ideology, and it's how forms of economic praxis, political praxis continue to be perpetuated by people who were colonized themselves. And that's what we really have to address. And I don't think that's been addressed adequately.
All right, thank you so much, Prof. I agree with how it hasn't been addressed properly all this time, as because I've been really interested with Indonesian politics as well. But then I think we would like to move on to questions in the question box. There's a question. I'll read the question for you. At the same time, the idea of the nation state and the underlying assumption of competition among nation states emphasize that every nation state must pursue a capitalist economy. Otherwise, it risks facing an existential crisis. In this way, capitalism is legitimized not only in economic terms, but also through cultural, religious, national, and security discourse. Given this capitalism, which was introduced through colonialism, subsequently internalized, and today reinforced through new narrative and forms, to what extent is it possible to produce a counter discourse? Are there any examples that you consider particularly successful in this regard?
Okay, two answers to that. The first is, I think we need to understand that, even the kind of capitalism that we're talking about today is, an evolution or perhaps even an aberration of the history of mercantilism that goes all the way back to the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, right? I mean, what you have now is not just capitalism, it's weaponized capitalism. And if there's one person you should read Yanis Varoufakis, who's been talking about the new feudalism of tech oligarchs, because we have moved to that point. We're not talking about simple capitalism or mercantilism of the 15th, 16th, or 17th centuries, where it's simply, people come, they trade. I sell you rice, you sell me wheat, I sell you oil, you sell me gas. Yep. I mean, what we have now is a conjunction of several things that were all inherent within capitalism itself, right? I mean, monopolistic tendencies. I mean, look at the entertainment industry. Everything you watch now in the cinema, on Netflix or whatever, how many major global conglomerates control almost every single thing you see and read? And that is a long way away from the beginnings of free market economies, which was not meant to do that. And don't forget that there was a long history, even in countries like England, where political elites were very worried about the emergence of conglomerates and monopolies. And there's a long economic history of governments, politicians, legislating laws to prevent the rise of these powerful cartels. Now, today, that's all gone. So that's one. And I think, too, you also have to remember that, capitalism doesn't come from the West. I mean, Asian societies, African societies were also engaged in trade, right? So that's how we interacted. That's how you have intercivilizational, interaction and discourse in the past. Africa traded with Asia, Asia traded with Africa, Africa traded with the Arab world traded with the Western world. And so there's always been a history of capitalism in all societies, including even perhaps, I mean, I don't like to call them primitive, but even in the most basic societies, you have some kind of market economy. There's nothing wrong with that per se. What worries me is this weaponization of capitalism. I mean, like I said, if you look at what's happening in Indonesia now, it seems that when foreign shareholders and foreign capitalists are pulling their money out of Indonesia, it is a response to the Indonesian government saying, look, we want to control our own natural resources. We're not going to sell everything to you because we know that this is valuable, for certain industries like, computers and laptops and iPhones and what have you. And so these are our national assets, and we want to control our national assets. We will trade with you, but we will trade on you on terms that are more equitable. Now, the reaction of the market has been to crash the Indonesian economy. It's almost like a form of punishment, and that's what worries me. That's what worries me. To condemn trade per se would be ridiculous. Even the Soviet Union, even in communist societies, there was trade, right? I mean, you still buy things, for heaven's sakes. You produce things and you buy things. That's not the issue. The issue is the way in which markets have become weaponized and capital has become weaponized. And this is a modern phenomenon. It really takes off from the late 18th and throughout the 19th century. So I think this is what we need to understand. So the second part of the question, are there any systems that alternatives that we can look at? I think there have been many attempts to create alternative markets, pan-Asian markets. You talk about Islamic finance, Islamic economics, but by and large, even these alternatives work within more or less the same paradigm. They work within the paradigm of, market success and the parameters of what constitutes success to dominate markets and what have you. And if that's the case, then you're just replacing one kind of hegemony with another kind of hegemony. I don't think that's liberating in any way. And I think we need to understand that there was a time in human history across the world, in the West, in the North and South, East and West, where there was an understanding that markets can also serve human ends. Markets can also serve, humanitarian ends. Like, for instance, in the early days of mercantilism, merchants were consciously aware of the fact that their wealth was the result of, well, in a sense, exploitation, but also, enormous profit making. And a lot of that profit was plowed back into society in the form of endowments, universities, colleges, libraries. A lot of the libraries and museums of the West were basically built by entrepreneurs who wanted to put back into the community. Now, if you look at today's economics, you don't see that. We don't see that. And that's why I think one of the most prescient thinkers today is Yanis Varoufakis, when he talks about the new techno-feudalism which I think is very alarming, and it's very sobering for all of us. Because you remember, early capitalism, was still very much market-based in a very simple, traditional way. I produce A, I sell it to you, I sell you A for X. Yeah. Now we have gone beyond manufacturing. We live in a post-industrial, late capitalist era where traditional understandings of jobs, careers, productivity have all changed. Yeah. And this is going to have an impact on all of us. Compared to my generation, the next generation, Kalisha's generation, will grow up living in a world where jobs are no longer secure, careers don't exist, the possibility of, finding identity and meaning through political and economic praxis is less and less. And I think that is very alarming. And so countries like Indonesia, or the rest of us, all of us, have to sit down and seriously ask, okay, if this is the problem, how do we get out of it? Now, when we talk about alternatives, all the alternatives I've seen so far, to be honest, are not very impressive, because they're just other forms of capitalism, without actually asking. There's a lot of talk about ethics in market, yeah, ethics in capitalism, but a lot of it has just been talk, yeah, because if you really want to have, ethical economics doesn't mean economics that is somehow based on religious discourse or what have you. To protect your national assets, to protect your own population, to protect your workers, that's also ethical economics. And yet many governments, especially in the developing world, are no longer able to do that because of the enormous economic pressures that are being put on them all the time. What's likely to happen? Yeah. If you look at Indonesia now, I think the rupiah will continue to crash. I think the stock market will continue to crash. But what the foreign investor community is basically saying to Indonesia is, we don't want you to do this. Yeah, we don't want you to protect your economy. We don't want you to protect your assets. We don't want you to have these welfare programs. Make it easier for us, international global capital, to come in and take what we want. Now, that is not liberatory. Yeah, it doesn't liberate anyone. It doesn't serve any humane goals for Indonesians, and it's going to make Indonesians suffer even more. And I think that is something that's, again, the reason why, you go back to the Bandung Conference of 1955, right? When the countries of Asia and Africa came together, one of the things that many of these, political elites understood at the time is that all these countries from Asia, from Africa, had now become new independent states. But they were very aware of the fact that they lived in a very volatile and dangerous world where their attempts to gain true independence would be blocked by external forces that wanted to keep the status quo intact. I think we are still in that situation. I know I have a book called The Long Shadow of the 19th Century. I don't think we ever left the 19th century. And I think what we are seeing now is really, a continuation of many things that we saw from the 19th to 20th century.
All right. Thank you so much, Prof. Farish. I do notice that you mentioned the weaponized of capitalism, and that actually leads me to another questions regarding it. So in this multipolar war, do you see emerging groupings such as BRICS or South-South cooperation initiatives as realistic avenues for greater economic sovereignty for countries of the global South?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I think, again, going back to Indonesia, I'm sorry if I talk about Indonesia a lot, but I think what's happening here is very, relevant to me. I think one of the reasons why Indonesia has been getting a lot of, flack and criticism is because of the decision to join BRICS. Now, again, like I said, a lot of these alternative pacts do not radically reject the logic of capitalism per se, but they are trying to basically, if you like, soften, the impact of monopolization and hegemony and dominance. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that BRICS wanted to push for was less reliance on the use of the US dollar. And there's nothing wrong with that as far as I'm concerned. I think the countries of the South do not need to use the US dollar for international trade. But the consequence of that is that, of course, it immediately threatens, American economic dominance and American economic hegemony. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why now we see this sustained attack on Indonesia's markets. This is, like I said, it's a form of punishment. It's a way of punishing Indonesia for being independent, for trying to be independent. Unfortunately, it's made worse by, I think, some policy mistakes on the part of the Indonesian government as well. I think some of the policies, some of the populist policies do not make economic sense. They cannot be sustained in the long run. They're an enormous drain on the national budget. But having said that, like I said, Indonesia has always been regarded as an important country in Southeast Asia. I mean, throughout the Cold War, apart from Vietnam, the other country that was regarded as important was Indonesia, because the West did not want Indonesia to become an anti-Western country. And so, yeah, in that sense, that's what I mean by the weaponization of capital. And now countries with economic clout can do this, yeah? They can compel you to use their currencies. They can compel you to, join them in their boycotts of other countries. I mean, all these things impinge on the economic independence and sovereignty of developing countries. Yeah. So we cannot escape the fact that all of this is all about violence and power. It's not violence in the conventional sense. Yeah. It's not, you don't have to invade countries anymore, yeah, to do damage. You can damage them economically. And in fact, the economic damage is actually much, much worse because it's lasting. But of course, yeah, like you mentioned, yeah, Kalisa, things like BRICS are important because BRICS was not meant to end the EU. It was not meant to end, the American market. BRICS was meant to be another avenue. Yeah, it's another avenue for international trade. And I think having multiple choices, multiple avenues is very important for countries in the third world, because we are always given the worst choices because we are economically weak and we are economically dependent. So to have alternatives is important. Now, when you attack these alternatives, when you make it impossible to have alternative frameworks for trade and commerce and what have you, then basically we are creating, again, what Varoufakis calls this, this technocratic elite, this sort of feudal techno oligarchs who basically want to govern the entire planet the way they want to see it governed. And I think that, whether we like it or not, that's a question of power and politics. We cannot escape this.
All right. Thank you so much for answering that question for me. And there's actually another question in the question box. Would you like to answer this final question?
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, all right, I'll read it for you. So the question is saying a lot of discourse about the decolonizations exist with a certain romanticizing of authoritarian and oppressive regimes because they are critical of colonial Western ideologies like Iran and etc. Or sell the politics of preserving of their original culture values like India, Pakistan, or etc. That makes the discourse counterproductive. And how can one ensure that talking about decolonizations doesn't circle back upholding other forms of oppressions?
Yes, I completely agree with that. And I think this is one of the things that worries me the most about decolonization. I don't know who asked that question, but it's a very good question. And I've been thinking about this along with my colleagues for the last 10 years, in fact. Yeah. I mean, the thing we need to be very cautious about is when, political elites use decolonization merely as a means to critique the West without critiquing themselves at the same time. Like I said, yeah, if you want to understand colonization includes collaboration. It would have been impossible for the West to colonize Africa and Asia without Asians and Africans being part of colonization. Okay. Now, many of these elites who were part of that are now the ones who are also, using the language of decolonization to critique the West in order to excuse themselves for the harm that they are doing to their own societies. Now, okay, let's be honest here. Yeah. As much as, I think the legacy of colonialism has a lot to answer for, and all the injustices and the inequalities that were created during colonialism, need to be addressed. But the fact remains that after the 1950s, when most of Africa and Asia was, independent, a lot of the injustices in our societies were created by ourselves, by our own political elites. And many of these political elites, ironically, use the language of nationalism, which is a modern Western concept, to justify their kinds of nation building, which often led to other things like, the persecution of minorities, the exploitation of minorities, the exploitation of natural resources. I mean, you can't blame foreign capital for the destruction of the rainforests in Southeast Asia, because this cannot happen without the connivance and without the collaboration of Southeast Asian states. So Southeast Asian governments are directly implicated themselves, yeah, in what has been happening in our part of the world. So let's be very cautious, and I'm glad the question was asked, because I get very worried when I see decolonization as a concept used politically. I mean, that's what we can call the weaponization of decolonization, right? So you use it as a weapon to critique the West or to get the West off your back so that you can continue with a kind of brutal exploitation of your own societies and your own economies at the same time. And I think that does a enormous disservice to decolonization as a project. Yeah, remember, one of the things that we try to do in decolonization is to explore and understand colonization comprehensively. And that's why, like I said, right, I mean, it's important to talk about the collaboration that took place during colonization, because that's how colonization actually worked. Yeah. And so without doing that, then your so-called decolonization is simply just, window dressing. It's simply using terms like decolonization to justify internal colonization and internal exploitation. And that happens all the time nowadays in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in East Asia, and in Africa as well. And I think that's something that we need to call out. When we see it, we cannot be silent and allow certain communitarian political elites to exploit the concept of decolonization just to serve their own agendas. And all these elites, by the way, yeah, they're very happy to accuse the West of everything that's wrong in their societies, but these are the same elites who sell out their societies, exploit their societies. And where do they put their money? They put their money in the West. They go and buy houses and mansions and go on holiday in the West. So there's a terrible hypocrisy there as well. But thank you for that question.
Thank you so much for answering our final question, Prof. That was another good insight to be heard. And also with that question answer, I think we will end our session for today. So I would like to let you to give you your final remark for the webinar.
No, nothing. I'm just happy that we managed to do this, and I think that discussions like this need to be had as much as possible in all avenues. And thank you for spending a afternoon with us as well. And so thank you to Jazz for organizing this.
All right, thank you so much. And I would like to thank you, our audience, as well, for listening to our very insightful webinar this afternoon. And we would like to address as well that we do a lot of webinar in the future, and there's a lot of upcoming webinars as well. So please, if you wish to attend more webinar of Jazz, please go check on Jazz website. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And thank you so much, Prof. Farish, for speaking for today. Thank you
Take
so
care.
much, everyone. Thank you.